The Dukes of Hazzard wasn't just a TV show, it was a wild, rebellious heartbeat of small-town America. With roaring engines, dirt road chases, and that unforgettable orange Dodge Charger, the Duke boys became legends. For millions, Friday nights meant one thing: jumping into the General Lee and outrunning the rules. But behind the fast cars and country charm, the real lives of the cast were far more complicated. Some stars became overnight icons only to disappear just as fast. Others battled personal demons, fading fame, or heartbreak hidden behind the smiles. And as the years passed, the legacy of Hazzard County became heavier, tangled in nostalgia, controversy, and the quiet weight of time. So buckle up. We're heading back to Hazzard one last time. Denver Pyle as Uncle Jesse Duke. Denver Pyle was born on May 11, 1920 in Bethune, Colorado. But to millions of Dukes of Hazzard fans, he will forever be Uncle Jesse, the grizzled, wise, shotgun-toting patriarch of the Duke family. With his long white beard and gravelly voice, Jesse wasn't just the heart of the Duke clan, he was the soul of Hazzard County itself. When the Dukes of Hazzard premiered in 1979, Denver was already 58 years old and a seasoned Hollywood veteran. He had appeared in over 100 films and TV shows, often playing sheriffs, soldiers, or grumpy sidekicks. But Uncle Jesse was different. It was the role that allowed him to show his depth not just as a character actor, but as a man of warmth, grit, and fierce loyalty. Off-screen, Denver Pyle carried that same sense of quiet strength. He had served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and lived through the golden age of Hollywood, working with legends like John Wayne and Elvis Presley. But fame never changed him. He stayed grounded even when the world around him spun fast. His personal life, however, was touched by sadness. He divorced in the 1970s and never remarried. He had 2 sons but kept them away from the spotlight, believing in privacy over publicity. In later years, he retreated from Hollywood to focus on a small oil business he'd started in Texas, one that quietly made him a millionaire, though he rarely talked about it. As Uncle Jesse, Denver wasn't just delivering lines. He was channeling something real, a lifetime of wisdom, loss, and resilience. Fans didn't just love him, they trusted him. When Uncle Jesse spoke, even Bo and Luke listened. In 1997, Denver Pyle was diagnosed with lung cancer. He passed away on Christmas Day that year at the age of 77. True to form, his final wish was simple. No big fuss, no press, just peace. He left behind a quiet fortune, a sprawling Texas ranch, and a legacy that can't be measured in money. Because Denver Pyle didn't just play Uncle Jesse, he was Uncle Jesse. A steady hand in a world full of chaos. A symbol of old-school American decency. And when the General Lee soared over another jump, you could bet Jesse Duke was back on the farm. Watching, waiting, and keeping the family together just like Denver Pyle always did. Sorrel Book as Boss Hogg. Sorrel Book was born on January 4, 1930 in Buffalo, New York. And though his most iconic role was that of Jefferson Davis, Boss Hogg, the cigar-chomping, white-suited, delightfully corrupt commissioner of Hazzard County in real life, Sorrel couldn't have been more different. On The Dukes of Hazzard, Boss Hogg was loud, scheming, and cartoonishly greedy, the ultimate Southern villain. But Sorrel Book was a classically trained actor, a Yale and Columbia graduate who spoke 5 languages fluently, including Mandarin. He was a man of astonishing intellect and grace who somehow made audiences fall in love with a character they were supposed to hate. When the show premiered in 1979, Sorrel was nearly 50. He had already built a respectable career on Broadway television and film, often playing diplomats, doctors, or sharp-tongued lawyers. But Boss Hogg gave him something he'd never had before: recognition. Children shouted his name on the street. Adults mimicked his voice. And Sorrel, he embraced it with joy. But behind the scenes, his story was tinged with sorrow. Sorrel had once been married and had 2 children. But after a painful divorce in the 1970s, he never remarried. The breakup left emotional scars he rarely discussed. Instead, he buried himself in work and in caring for his children, who became his entire world. Co-stars described him as gentle, generous, and endlessly professional. On set, he was often seen sipping tea and reciting Shakespeare between takes. What few fans knew was how much physical strain the role of Boss Hogg caused him. Despite being naturally slim, Sorrel wore a padded fat suit and heavy layers in the sweltering Georgia heat, sometimes in temperatures over 38 degrees Celsius. He never complained. He believed in giving the audience everything. As the show ended in the mid-1980s, Sorrel gradually withdrew from Hollywood. He did some voice acting and returned to the stage briefly, but his health began to decline in the early 90s. In 1994, at the age of 64, Sorrel Book passed away from colorectal cancer. His death didn't make front-page news. But for those who loved the Dukes of Hazzard, it felt like the loss of something irreplaceable, a laugh, a wink, a presence larger than life. And yet for all the over-the-top antics of Boss Hogg, Sorrel Book left behind a much quieter legacy, kindness, depth, and the rare ability to make even a villain lovable. Waylon Jennings as the Ballader. He was never seen on screen, but you heard him in every episode. That laid-back voice full of grit and mischief, narrating the chaos of Hazzard County with a wink and a southern drawl that was Waylon Jennings. Born on June 15, 1937 in Littlefield, Texas, Waylon didn't just sing about rebels. He was one. Long before the Dukes of Hazzard, Waylon was already a legend, a founding father of outlaw country music, a man who broke free from Nashville's polished grip to sing with raw honesty about life, heartbreak, and freedom. When producers brought him on as both narrator and performer of the show's now iconic theme song, Good Old Boys, they didn't just get a voice. They got an attitude and a soul. Waylon's narration became the heartbeat of the series. With each episode, his voice reminded us that the Duke boys weren't just troublemakers, they were folk heroes. His words gave the show a sense of myth, of mischief, and of meaning. But behind that voice was a man who had lived through fire. Waylon battled demons for most of his life. Drug addiction, financial ruin, and the haunting guilt of being the man who gave up his seat on the plane that crashed and killed Buddy Holly. That moment in 1959 stayed with him forever. He once said, "I felt like I should have died instead." It was a wound that no song could heal. During the height of the Dukes of Hazzard, Waylon was still fighting personal battles. He struggled with cocaine addiction, once spending over $1,000 a day to feed his habit. But somehow he always showed up for the music, for the show, for the fans. In the late 1980s, he finally kicked the addiction for good, crediting his wife, Jessie Coulter, with saving his life. In his later years, Waylon's health began to decline. Diabetes took its toll, and in 2001, part of his left foot was amputated. Still, he kept singing, kept writing, kept living on his own terms. He wasn't chasing the charts. He was chasing truth. Waylon Jennings passed away on February 13, 2002, at the age of 64. His death sent a quiet shock through the world of country music and through fans of the Dukes of Hazzard who suddenly realized that the voice behind their childhood had gone silent. James Best as Sheriff Rosco P. Coltrane. James Best was born on July 26, 1926, in Powderly, Kentucky. But to fans of the Dukes of Hazzard, he was always Sheriff Rosco P. Coltrane, the bumbling, trigger-happy lawman whose voice cracked with every cuff 'em and stuff 'em, and whose patrol car rarely survived the episode. Rosco was funny, ridiculous, lovable, and thanks to James Best, unforgettable. But behind the slapstick and silly catchphrases was a man of real talent, real discipline, and real heartbreak. By the time the Dukes of Hazzard premiered in 1979, James Best had already been acting for over 3 decades. A veteran of film and television, he'd appeared alongside Hollywood legends like Jimmy Stewart and Audie Murphy, often in gritty westerns and war dramas. He was trained in method acting, taught by Lee Strasberg, and brought serious chops to a role that required him to fall in mud crash cars and yell Enos with unfiltered glee. The truth is, James Best made Rosco work because he didn't play him as a fool, but as a lonely man with a heart clinging to the last scraps of power in a town run by chaos. His comedic timing was razor sharp, but the real magic was his warmth. Children loved Rosco not because he was scary, but because he never really wanted to catch the Duke boys. He just wanted to matter. Off-screen James was just as multifaceted. He was an artist, a painter, a writer, and a musician. He also taught acting for over 25 years, mentoring countless young performers, many of whom described him as tough, but generous, like Rosco, with a soul. But life wasn't always kind. James struggled financially after the Dukes ended. He resented being typecast and found it difficult to land more serious roles. Still, he never stopped working. He wrote screenplays, painted landscapes, and even starred in small indie films well into his 80s. He toured the country with Dukes of Hazzard fan events, not for ego, but because the fans gave him something Hollywood had started to forget: appreciation. He was married twice and found peace in his second marriage to Dorothy Best. They settled in Florida, where he taught, painted, and spent quiet days fishing and walking his dogs. Even as age caught up with him, he remained sharp, always ready with a story, always proud of the joy Rosco had brought to generations. James Best passed away on April 6, 2015 at the age of 88 from complications of pneumonia. The news brought an outpouring of tributes from fans and co-stars alike, not just for the Sheriff of Hazzard County, but for the kind, wise, endlessly creative man behind the badge. He once said, "I never played Rosco as stupid. I played him as a child. Because a child, even when he loses, always believes he can win next time. And maybe that's why we loved him. Because deep down, Rosco P. Coltrane, like James Best, never gave up on the good guys." Rick Hurst as Deputy Cletus Hogg. Rick Hurst was born on January 1, 1946 in Houston, Texas. But to fans of the Dukes of Hazzard, he was known simply as Cletus, the well-meaning, dim-witted deputy who meant no harm, but rarely got anything right. With a slow smile, a clumsy swagger, and a heart too soft for the badge he wore, Cletus wasn't chasing justice, he was just trying to keep up. Rick joined the show in its second season, filling in while Sonny Schroyer, Deputy Enos, was off filming a spin-off. But Hurst's version of the small-town deputy quickly won hearts. He wasn't mean, he wasn't scary, he was just Cletus fumbling through every chase, crashing into nearly everything, and somehow making it feel like the most natural thing in the world. What made Rick Hurst special was how he never treated the role like a joke. Even at the height of the show's slapstick chaos, there was something genuine about the way he played Cletus. Behind the silly grins and pratfalls was an actor who deeply understood timing, tone, and character. And he made kids laugh without ever mocking the character he portrayed. Off-screen, Rick was known for being humble, warm, and endlessly approachable. He never acted like a star, and maybe that's why fans loved him. He frequently appeared at fan conventions, always with a story, always with a handshake, and never turning away someone who just wanted to say thank you. But like many of his co-stars, Rick struggled with the slow fade of fame. After the Duke's roles became fewer, and the industry moved on. He took guest parts here and there, worked behind the scenes, and poured himself into local theater. He never chased headlines, he simply kept doing what he loved. In his final years, Rick lived quietly in Georgia, not far from where the Dukes of Hazzard was originally filmed. He lived a modest life filled with old scripts, faded photos, and the occasional letter from fans who still remembered Cletus with fondness. He loved gardening, old westerns, and long phone calls with his grandchildren. Rick Hurst passed away peacefully on March 2, 2025 at the age of 79. His death didn't lead the news. There were no viral tributes. But in the hearts of Dukes of Hazzard fans, something gentle was lost that day. Christopher Mayer as Vance Duke. Christopher Mayer was born on February 21, 1954 in New York City. And for one unforgettable season, he became part of Hazzard history as Vance Duke, one of the replacement Dukes, during a behind-the-scenes contract dispute in 1982. It was a tough position stepping into the boots of beloved characters Bo and Luke, but Christopher took it on with charm, grace, and a quiet determination to win over fans. Alongside Byron Cherry Coy, Duke Mayer's character was introduced in Season 5 when John Schneider and Tom Wopat walked off the show. Fans were outraged at first, but Christopher didn't let it shake him. He gave it everything, bringing Vance to life with rugged good looks, earnest energy, and a genuine sense of brotherhood. And slowly, some viewers came around. But no matter how hard he tried, the shadow of Bo and Luke loomed large. When Schneider and Wopat returned mid-season, Christopher and Byron were quietly written out. No dramatic exit, no real closure, just gone. It was a tough blow. Christopher Mayer had stepped into a storm he didn't create and paid the price. But rather than let it break him, he carried on, off-screen. Christopher's life was filled with passion, struggle, and quiet heartbreak. He continued acting in small roles throughout the 80s and 90s, including guest spots on Silk Stockings and Star Trek Deep Space Nine, but never again found a role that gave him the spotlight or the scars of Vance Duke. He was married briefly to actress Eileen Davidson, the young and the restless, and later had 3 daughters whom he loved deeply. But his personal life was often stormy. He battled depression and struggled with his sense of identity in the years after the Dukes. Fame had knocked on his door and just as quickly vanished. Friends described him as sensitive, kind, and introspective, someone who felt things deeply, often too deeply. He withdrew from Hollywood in the 2000s, choosing instead to live quietly far from the spotlight that once burned too bright. On July 23, 2011, Christopher Mayer passed away from natural causes, a sudden death at the age of just 57. He died alone in his home in Sherman Oaks, California. No scandal, no headlines, just silence. Don Pedro Collie as Sheriff Little. Don Pedro Collie was born on August 30, 1938 in Klamath Falls, Oregon, and though he only appeared in a handful of Dukes of Hazzard episodes, his presence as Sheriff Big Ed Little left a lasting impression. Towering, commanding, and cool as a southern breeze, Sheriff Little was one of the few lawmen who could actually go toe-to-toe with Rosco boss Hogg, and even the Duke boys. Introduced as Chickasaw County's no-nonsense sheriff, Collie's character was a refreshing change, a black officer of the law in a show set deep in rural Georgia. He didn't yell, he didn't stumble, he didn't play the fool. Instead, he carried himself with dignity, toughness, and quiet wit. And in a series full of over-the-top characters, Don Pedro Collie stood out by doing less and meaning more. But Sheriff Little was just a small chapter in a long and extraordinary career. Don Pedro Collie had studied architecture and athletics at the University of Oregon. At one point, he even trained for the U.S. Olympic team in discus and shot put. But it was acting, not sports, that would define his life. He moved to San Francisco, studied drama, and never looked back. Through the 1970s and 80s, Collie became a familiar face in genre cinema. He played the wise SRT in Beneath the Planet of the Apes, the ominous Joshua in The Omega Man, and appeared alongside blaxploitation icons like Pam Grier. He brought gravitas and grace to every role, a rarity for black actors in his era, especially in supporting parts often written with little respect. Collie never chased stardom. He chased truth in performance. And when the Dukes of Hazzard cast him as Sheriff Little, he made sure the role wasn't a caricature. It was a man, real proud and fiercely competent. For many black viewers in the South, it meant something to see him there, calm, strong, and unshakable. Off-screen, Collie was a gentle soul. He loved gardening, jazz, and vintage cars. He rarely gave interviews, but when he did, he spoke warmly of his time in Hazzard County. He saw it for what it was, a fun, loud, good-hearted show with room for people like him, even if just for a few scenes. In his later years, Don Pedro Collie returned to the convention circuit where fans still remembered his deep voice and magnetic screen presence. He never acted like a star, just a man grateful to be remembered. On October 11, 2017, Collie passed away at the age of 79 after a battle with cancer. His passing was quiet, almost too quiet for a man who had carried so much strength, dignity, and talent through an industry that rarely offered enough in return. Nedra Volz as Ms. Emma Tisdale. Nedra Volz was born on June 18, 1908 in Montrose, Iowa. And by the time she rolled into Hazzard County in her beat-up mail truck, she had already lived a life fuller than most. As Ms. Emma Tisdale, the town's elderly mail carrier, with a feisty streak and a no-nonsense glare, Nedra didn't just steal scenes, she stole hearts. She was tiny, gray-haired, and always a little disheveled, but Ms. Tisdale had more grit than Rosco. more common sense than Boss Hogg, and more attitude than the Duke boys combined. Whenever Nedra appeared on screen, audiences perked up, because they knew something funny, heartfelt, or quietly powerful was about to happen. But Nedra Volz's journey to television stardom didn't begin until most actresses her age had already retired. She began her career as a child in vaudeville, singing and dancing on stage alongside her family in the 1910s and 20s. Then for decades, she disappeared from the spotlight, raising a family working behind the scenes, living a quiet life far from the camera's glare. It wasn't until her 60s that Nedra returned to show business. And when she did, she became an icon. In the 1970s and 80s, she was everywhere. All in the Family, Different Strokes, The Love Boat. The A-Team WKRP in Cincinnati, always playing the sweet but sassy older lady who could steal a scene with just one line. But the Dukes of Hazzard gave her something special. Ms. Tisdale wasn't just a gag character. She was family. Hazzard's backbone, its wisdom, its heart. Off-screen, Nedra was just as beloved. Cast and crew adored her. Always early, always prepared, always laughing. She treated everyone, stars, extras, camera crew, with the same kindness. She never saw herself as famous, even when fans lined up just to meet her. To Nedra, acting was fun, a blessing, a second act she never expected but deeply appreciated. She continued working well into her 80s, making her final on-screen appearance in the early 1990s. After retiring, she returned to California to spend time with her grandchildren, tending her garden and watching reruns of the shows that had given her a second life. Nedra Volz passed away on January 20th, 2003 at the age of 94. Her death came quietly, but her memory still lives loud in the hearts of fans who saw in her not just a performer, but a reminder that age is no limit to joy, mischief, or meaning. Ernie Lively as Longstreet B. Davenport. Ernie Lively was born on January 29, 1947 in Baltimore, Maryland, and while he may have only appeared in a handful of Dukes of Hazzard episodes as the cantankerous but lovable mechanic Longstreet B. Davenport, his presence added an earthy, authentic charm to Hazzard County, grumbling under the hood of a dusty old truck or yelling across the garage. Longstreet wasn't just another side character. He was a reminder that even in a town full of chaos, someone had to keep the wheels turning. And Ernie Lively played him with the kind of gruff heart that made you believe he'd been fixing engines and giving unwanted advice for decades. But off-screen, Ernie's story was far richer than the few scenes he had in Hazzard. He was a Navy veteran, a high school English teacher, and later a powerful character actor who made a name for himself in Hollywood the old-fashioned way by grinding. He had over 100 television and film credits, from The Waltons and Falcon Crest to Turner and Hooch Passenger 57 and The West Wing. He never chased stardom. He worked hard, constantly. And perhaps his most important role of all, he was the patriarch of one of Hollywood's most beloved families. Ernie Lively was the father of actress Blake Lively and a father figure to many others. He didn't just support his children's careers, he coached them, mentored them, and reminded them of the value of humility. Blake often credited him as her rock, her teacher, and her inspiration. In fact, in a poetic twist, when she filmed The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, Ernie played her on-screen dad, a moment that mirrored their real-life bond. Later in life, Ernie faced serious health issues, including a massive heart attack that nearly took his life in 2003. But he was a fighter. In 2013, he underwent groundbreaking stem cell heart surgery that gave him nearly a decade more to live, love, and create memories with his family. He passed away on June 3, 2021 at the age of 74 in Los Angeles, surrounded by those who loved him most. His death didn't lead headlines, but the grief in the hearts of his family, friends, and fans was deep and real. Dick Sargent as Sheriff Grady Bird. Dick Sargent was born on April 19, 1930 in Carmel, California. Best known to television audiences as the second Darren on Bewitched, Sargent made a brief but memorable appearance on the Dukes of Hazzard as Sheriff Grady Bird, one of the rare lawmen from outside Hazzard who wasn't crooked, clumsy, or comedic. Calm, reasonable, and straight-edged Grady Bird was a refreshing presence, and Sargent played him with quiet authority and natural charm. But Dick Sargent's impact on television stretched far beyond that one appearance. He was part of the American living room for decades, from sitcoms and family shows to dramas and westerns. His boyish smile and easygoing demeanor made him a favorite of casting directors and a comforting presence to viewers. But behind the affable persona was a man who carried quiet burdens for most of his life. In 1969, when he stepped into the role of Darren Stevens on Bewitched, replacing Dick York, he inherited more than just a character. He inherited the expectations of millions of fans, and though his performance was sincere and competent, comparisons were inevitable. Off-screen, he handled the pressure with grace, never bitter, always focused on the work. His on-screen chemistry with Elizabeth Montgomery helped stabilize the show through its final seasons. But privately, Sargent lived with a heavy secret, one that for decades he could never speak about. It wasn't until 1991, just 3 years before his death, that he publicly came out as gay, in an industry that often forced actors to hide their truth. Sargent's decision was both brave and quietly radical. He called himself a retroactive role model, regretting that he hadn't come out sooner, especially for the younger generation struggling with identity and acceptance. After coming out, he became a passionate advocate for LGBTQ+ rights and AIDS awareness, especially during a time when public fear and stigma were at their peak. He participated in marches, lent his voice to charity events, and stood proudly as a symbol of quiet courage. In the early 1990s, Sargent was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He battled the disease with dignity, continuing to work as long as his health allowed. He passed away on July 8, 1994, at the age of 64. His death came just 3 years after he had finally spoken his truth to the world, a truth that in many ways became his greatest legacy. Dick Sargent's time in Hazzard County was brief, but his impact on American television and on those who watched, admired, and were inspired by his honesty runs much deeper. The Dukes of Hazzard was more than a show. It was family fun and freedom. And behind every laugh, every car chase was a real person with a story far deeper than the script ever told. Some are gone, some remain, but all of them left a mark. So when you hear that guitar riff or see the General Lee take flight, remember you're not just watching TV, you're revisiting a legacy. Thanks for coming back to Hazzard with us. Like, share, and subscribe to keep their stories alive. We'll see y'all next time.